Hello, welcome everyone to Religion 101. I'm James Light. Hi, Cheryl. And I'm a member of the board of directors of the South Coast Interfaith Council and also a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to welcome everyone here tonight, and also really grateful for Reverend Elena Larssen to be our speaker. It wasn't that long ago that she was resident of the Long Beach and South Bay area, and she has moved on to greener pastures, if you'd say, and a different position. And so really appreciate her taking the time, because it's a little later there on the East Coast, to participate with us. So definitely recognize that and really appreciate and look forward to hearing from you, Elena. So before we get started, I'll just briefly give an overview of sort of the structure of our seminar for everyone, and especially for those who are visiting the first time. First of all, we'll give about an hour typically to our speaker to talk about their church or religion or faith community, the origins, important doctrines to them, or practices, cultural practices that are significant for them. And sometimes, and then also, I always ask them to talk about how they help young people to make good decisions, because I think it's interesting to me, and I think all of us recognize how valuable it is for us to help our young people to make good decisions. There's lots of pressures to think negative things, to do negative things, and so I always ask about that. And then we usually take another 30 to 60 minutes for folks to ask questions. We always have quite a number of great questions. I really appreciate that. And then I do remind folks that our purpose here is really to learn about the church or religion or faith community of our speaker. So it's not so much that we so we don't want to necessarily have a debate about some point of doctrine or something like that. Although I find that my experience with Religion 101 is that it is interesting for folks to share. We do some comparisons and contrasting of sort of what we might do that's similar or different, and that's always very interesting as part of the learning process. So we also can start with a word of prayer or invocation, and I'll let you, Reverend Larssen, to either offer that yourself, or you can call on one of your maybe close relatives to if that seems appropriate. But anyway, whatever you feel comfortable with, and to offer it in the manner that you would normally, so not, because that's important for us to see how each of us pray in different ways, is also always very valuable. So, and then last thing I will preface to say is that Cheryl is on, and she's doing a great job of promoting an activity that we're participating in this week, and that is Long Beach Gives. And so it's an opportunity for folks to support and make donations to a wide variety of nonprofit organizations, including the South Coast Interfaith Council. So if anyone's interested, or if you have a chance to encourage folks from your community to support the SCIC, then it's a great opportunity to do so. And we've had a lot of programs going this week during the day and in the evening in concert with Long Beach Gives. So a lot of effort's been put into it, and I think a lot of great programming. I'll make mention of this at the end, but I do want to let everyone know that we do have a YouTube channel, and I'll just share the screen to it really quick. and it's the South Coast Interfaith Council YouTube channel. We have video recordings of our Long Beach Gives programs this week, featured programs, testimonials, and then Religion 101 as well. So it's been great to be able to post up these for folks who can't always attend live, and so I think it's great. It's becoming a great library of just representing the wonderful diversity that we have in among communities of faith. So I just want to make a little plug for that. Okay, so Reverend Larssen, we'll turn the time over to you.
Well, thank you very, very much for having me this evening. It is a pleasure. James, thanks for coordinating and bringing me into the process. And greetings to the SCIC staff. And shout out to Milia El-Islamajid, who welcomed me so warmly when I arrived in Long Beach in 2013 to be the senior minister at the First Congregational Church in downtown Long Beach. Very thankful, very grateful. My partner, Mark Pettis, got to serve with your board for a time and was named Man of the Year for his work in ecumenical and interfaith activity. And so I think our household is really known to be blessed by the work of South Coast Interfaith Council, and really, really grateful to see a vibrant model for interfaith work, relationship building, programming, that really is a model that can be an inspiration to other parts of the country.
So Milia shared a memory for her, is that First Congregational Church was the first church to ask her to provide a sermon. So she's also very grateful to First Congregational Church and the relationship we've had with you all over the years.
That's a wonderful thing to hear. Really, she had to kind of hold us back because we wanted her to come all the time, which was part of it. But the history is that Dr. Emerson Hangen, who was the senior minister in the mid-50s, was one of the founding pastors and sort of visionaries that there needed to be an ecumenical council in Southern California, ecumenical, bringing Christian churches together. And of course, times changed, and people in positions of leadership became more aware that the council should expand and have an interfaith focus as well. So really lovely, lovely history there. I have made a big transition. I was granted an appointment onto the national staff of my denomination, the United Church of Christ. So I am speaking to you today from my new home office here on the west side of Cleveland, 2 blocks away from Lake Erie. The national setting of the United Church of Christ has been in Cleveland for about 30 years. And I keep referring to my partner like he's sitting there, my spouse like he's sitting there. He's not sitting there. His computer is sitting there. But he and I were both appointed, me to a humanitarian post, coordinating volunteer ministries, particularly for young adults, service learning fellowships for young adults to learn and grow in the humanitarian parts of the church and its work. And he is the new ecumenical officer. So we're very proud and excited about that. And it's just really an interesting thing. One of the themes I think we'll hear tonight is how the tides of history change and form the structures of church life. That's certainly something that I have worked with a lot in my ministry and in my background. But that might be a theme that we hear tonight, as I have been asked to speak about the congregational tradition and the United Church of Christ, because form and function and the ways that structure and belief interact is a major theme in the congregational tradition in the United Church of Christ. And we pray lots of ways. But I will now offer an extemporaneous prayer of invocation. It is customary in our denomination to do things the way you think they should be done, which sometimes leads to wonderful diversity and sometimes can stray into eccentricity. But what I think I am proud of is that it allows for a diverse prayer vocabulary. And so I'm going to offer an extemporaneous prayer. And what I'll do first is I'll invite you to be comfortable in the place where you are seated with your feet flat on the floor as is possible for you, and to take a moment to quiet your mind and to allow your thoughts to descend into your heart, to be connected so that we are aware of our place in the universe of things. And so I would pray on behalf of this diverse group of people, gracious God, that you would be with us, to open our ears, to open our understanding to one another, to make us grateful for this very special space of sharing and learning, to grant that we would end this evening with a richer appreciation for the diversity of your world, its people, and the way that we all connect with you in ways that give glory to you and your creation. In your many names and in the strong name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. So what I did there, which is always like one of the best things about being a pastor, is that you get asked to pray before a meeting, and it makes every meeting more meaningful. It's also one of the worst things, because what if you're late and you don't feel ready, right? But that's why you always should be early when you're the pastor, because you might get asked to pray and you want to be emotionally and spiritually prepared to help people be present in the moment. But you know, my tradition encompasses a lot of different cultures, and there's a lot of respect in contemporary United Church of Christ life for meditation and for non-traditional spiritualities, Reiki, yoga. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you know. And so one thing I've tried to do is be mindful that inviting people to center their bodies and be aware of themselves in space is a way to honor people who are not coming from a traditional Christian background. And then for those of us who are from a traditional Christian background, to maybe invite some integration of body, mind, and spirit, which has not always been the strong suit in mainline Protestant Christianity. And we pray in the name of Jesus. You'll hear different UCC pastors say those words in different ways. Those of us who are maybe on the more left end of the spectrum will say things like, in your many names we pray, to acknowledge that there is wisdom in many of the world's religious traditions and spiritual practices. You will hear people who want to articulate their Christianity in the middle of a diverse world say things like the name of Jesus Christ or the strong name of Jesus. I was in a meeting the other day with a conference minister, which is sort of like a bishop, and I prayed in the name of Jesus Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, which is a very old-fashioned thing to say from the New Testament. And we finished the prayer, and she kind of had a little tear in her eye, and she said, you know, I haven't heard that in a long time, and I needed to hear it today. And it was, you know, I hadn't planned it. It was just a beautiful thing that happened because we were together and in prayer. And I have the permission in my religious tradition to look for many names and to lift up many names for the presence of the divine. So that is by way of preface. And James, may I have permission to share my screen? Do I have permission? I do. I made a little PowerPoint, so I'm going to bring that up. Let's get this. Give me a little tech moment here. The toolbar is hiding the space. Okay, we'll go to slideshow. There we go. And from the beginning. So congregationalism is the word you're going to hear a lot tonight. And it is a traditional part of the Protestant faith. I have a couple of I hope that you will permit a spirit of levity when I show you some of these charts trying to describe. Some of you have probably seen these before, trying to describe the evolution of Protestant Christianity. But to truck with labels for just a moment, Congregationalism in the United Church of Christ is very fairly described as a mainline Protestant denomination. Some people nowadays wish to describe the massive religious changes of the last few decades and call it an old line Protestant denomination, which is meant to be innovative and I think ends up sounding a bit pejorative, which is one of those things that can happen. But I have, of course, a fabulous chart to get us started. And this is meant to describe the ways in which Christianity evolved in its second millennium. And I present this because I think it's helpful, but I do advise that you take it with a bit of levity, because the idea that the massive, complex, nuanced history of a faith that encompasses such enormous populations over such a long stretch of time, I think it is worthy of taking it with a grain of salt. But what we see here on the left-hand side, of course, representing the past, is the idea that the Eastern and Western European Christian Church, in the big C sense of the word, a massive organization, divided in 1054, East and West. This is probably familiar territory for those of you who are regulars at this event. I will say what happened just after 1054 that is interesting, because I'm going to pepper this with personal stories, is that Denmark was Christianized, which meant that my ancestors on my father's side of my family were Christianized from their religious roots as worshipers of Nordic pagan gods, and swept into Christianity, which is now very much a Lutheran form of Christianity, a state church. And when we were there visiting family, we all went bananas over this jewelry store that had reproductions of archaeological pieces of jewelry that had been found in digs all over Scandinavia. And I got a cross that had a sea wolf holding the cross of Jesus Christ in its mouth. And it was meant to symbolize, it had been found, in some archaeological dig. It was meant to symbolize that change from an animistic and pagan Scandinavian religion to Christianity, that the sea wolf had been like the pre-Christian symbol, and then the cross came on. And I was in seminary at the time, so of course I was so excited about this, and have always appreciated this idea that my Christianity came from somewhere. To me, that is very powerful, because it means that I can relate with integrity to other people whose religions also come from somewhere. It's not that mine's the only correct one that appeared, I didn't open a box and find it, perfectly formed or whatever, that it came from somewhere, and that means that I could be respectful in engagement with another person who also had a story to tell about their religious development and history. So scooting along, you come across, and I have to move my camera. Oops, sorry guys, that was a mistake. That's the next confusing chart for our entertainment this evening. But I have to slide the, there we go. My videos were covering my notes here. When we come to the Protestant Reformation, we see that There's massive social upheaval in Western Europe. The Catholic Church comes under fire. Many precious tenets and essential cultural constructs come under fire. This is probably familiar territory for some of you who are interested in religions in general. And, very exciting for all of us who are, sort of into all these things. We recently had the 500-year anniversary of Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the doors of the church at Wittenberg and calling out the church. You probably have heard this story too. He had already written a number of attacks and critiques, and they had gone largely unnoticed. But when he critiqued the sale of indulgences, which was a cash transaction in relationship with the theology of salvation, which paid for a lot of bills, then people really noticed. Another big thing, of course, is the printing press comes about at this time. And so the dissident movements occurring in that time benefited from the ability of being able to print little paper tracts and to distribute their ideas in ways that had never been done before. And the church splinters in a couple of ways. You can see at the bottom, there is a line called Anabaptist. We may have Anabaptists with us here today. Then there's a Lutheran line, which is where, my Scandinavian side of my family ended up. And then we have this line, the Calvinists or the Reformed churches. Reformed is still a word that is used to describe people like Congregationalists and members of the United Church of Christ. Those of you who are Presbyterians, and I don't think you ever stopped being a Presbyterian, are in the Reformed tradition. And the theology of Calvin, Jean Calvin, becomes the informative piece, which is still practiced, studied, debated, dissented against today. And you can see the Congregationalists travel in a line forward, but that is not a very nuanced line, now is it? Because something very important happens in 1620, which is that the people who will become known as Congregationalists, but are not yet called that, come from England to Holland to the New World on a ship called the Mayflower. And those, my denomination in the United Church of Christ descends in an unbroken line from the Puritans and the Pilgrims, the Puritans of Massachusetts and the Pilgrims, in an unbroken line to today. Now, not an entirely unbroken line. It's more like a line that has sort of braided in pieces along the way, and we'll look at that in the next slide. But of course, the mythology of the Mayflower landing at Plymouth Rock, these things, it's amazing. They have an enormous cultural impact in our country. Like, we celebrate Thanksgiving as a federal holiday, right? And of course, with the awareness, the ever increasing awareness of how North America was conquered and what happened when Native peoples encountered the relentless expansionist notions of people coming from Europe, the extraordinary theft of land and genocide. I mean, I think that we are more and more looking for stories with details to be able to understand the traditions that we have been taught with some greater integrity. So we remember the Mayflower, but I always tried at First Congregational, which, if you know it, it's a congregation that enjoys getting into the grit of problematic questions and it has a powerful social justice commitment. I often would try on the Sunday before Thanksgiving to both preach it and preach against it, and really think about, okay, this happened. Our people came here. Colonialism, they were the colonists. Our people were the colonists. They are the ones. And what is our responsibility to tell that story and to tell it as accurately as we can with ever expanding sense of justice and fairness for all of the people whose lives, traditions, languages, were obliterated by that colonial expansion from the Mayflower. And the Mayflower, of course, was not just peopled with, respectable church folk. There were also like brigands and thieves, and they encountered just extraordinary hardship. But what's interesting about Congregationalists is that once they got onto the land and established their communities, theocratic communities, where the church was the center of town, and essentially citizenship and church membership were really entwined at this point in US history. Then they just lived. They lived longer. The early colonial generations had some of the longest lifespans in the history of the United States. Now, is it because they were so close to God that they were granted the blessing of long life? It is entirely possible that that is a thing, but they also lived extremely structured and rigorous lives, which probably lent a great deal to their physical health. And they brought with them that love of learning and a radical commitment to the education of their communities. And there is, of course, something very important about longevity that is connected with lifelong learning. So part of what happened is people came, they established their communities, and then they lived these extremely long and prolific lives. And so they had this outsized impact on the foundation of our country. And, to speak personally, one of the things that's interesting is that the way I was trained to lead a worship service, I was watching the inauguration of one of our presidents. I think it might have been President Obama, because it was a while ago now. And I was talking to somebody who was not religious, and I said, they were like, wow, this is kind of, quite a ceremony. And I said, honestly, if you took away the content and just left the structure of this event, this is exactly the structure of a congregational worship service in a traditional white congregational worship space. And they were like, what? And I was like, yep. Opening music, processional, prayers of invocation, formal readings from sacred texts or honored texts, expository preaching, like a charge about the action which is supposed to occur at the end of the ceremony. I was like, this is the thing. And so it's very interesting. In 2021, at a time when our liberal white congregations, many of, we really kind of want to thoughtfully divest ourselves of our privilege. And yet there's this imprimatur of our cultural norms in the very fibers of how our nation's texture unfurls. So these things I think are very interesting. Now I'm going to show you, please again, with a big grain of salt. Oh, I see a hand, Cheryl.
Before you move on, what is the dotted line?
Well, I don't know that dotted line makes 100% sense, but I think it has to do with the fact that that's when people came to the New World. Oh. So I don't think it's saying that the Anglican and Episcopal Church and the Calvinists joined in a way. I think that's demarcating that they started to shift into the New World. But I honestly, I'm not 100% sure what that particular broken line is.
No problem.
I think one thing, though, while we're talking about it, one thing that's really interesting, the Anglican Church becomes the Episcopal Church in the United States, and the Methodists break off from there. But now Methodists, Congregationalists, Lutheran are much more close in their practices and theology, and Episcopalians and Lutherans are closer in their religious culture and liturgical practices. So, like, even the lines sort of they evolve and they come together. And well, I'll just go to the next.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And I'm going to do a time check. Okay, I'm about halfway. So now, what is hilarious about this one is, first of all, it looks like someone just went bananas with a box of markers. But it also makes it look like the United Church of Christ is the culmination of all religious history. And I do not think that that is the stance of my denomination. In fact, I think we're a bit humble. I hope and think that we're a good bit more humble and would be a little bit abashed to see something that makes it look like all of religion was evolving toward our denomination. I don't encounter that attitude among our leadership. But what is helpful about this particular flow chart is that it takes that history and it sort of lumps it a little bit together. So you see here is the sort of the first millennium of Christian history and moving into the second millennium with medieval Catholicism and the second half. So here comes the Reformation with that big yellow bar, which then breaks out, as we've seen, into Lutheranism, Reformed Church. And why they put Congregationalism coming out of Anglicanism is because there were massive battles fought between the separatists who become the Congregationalists and the evolving Church of England. It doesn't make the best sense theologically, but it does make sense historically when you think about the fact that the separatists who become the Congregationalists were battling like literally against the Church of England. And so you see in this pale red bar, you see Congregationalism moving forward into history. This is 1800 right here. Congregationalism makes an intentional westward expansion, which is where I currently am, because Ohio was the frontier. And so there's even today, there's sort of an assumption that Ohio and Cleveland are the western edition of Connecticut, which is why we're in Eastern time, even though we're like 8 hours away from New York City. Interesting, but true. And then you see here, part of what happens as the 18th century moves into the 19th century, into the 20th century, you start to see building of structure. Because one of the things that Congregationalism did and distinguished itself from the other strands was this, and this is the defining characteristic, is an emphasis on the right of the congregation to organize itself. The pastor, the minister, to have total freedom of the pulpit, and for the congregation to set its own doctrine and teaching. So I, for example, have a published book of worship. I can open the book of worship and pull out the baptismal ceremony and use that baptismal ceremony. I also have the authority to write that baptismal ceremony with the congregation. Now, it does get more complicated than that, but that's a fundamental characteristic, which is part of why you do not go to one UCC church and hear the same exact service that you would hear at another UCC church, which I think that might be something that's worthy of discussion. What we think is valuable in having liturgical flexibility or a free church tradition versus a liturgical tradition where there would be a set schedule of prayers and content. What happens in the 20th century is that churches start to merge. The Congregational Church merges with the Christian Church, which is an American expansion, post-awakening denomination. They merge. At the same time, out of the Swiss and German Reformed tradition, there is this strain of Congregationalism that tracks through the Swiss and German Reformed Church into the United States in the form of the Evangelical and Reformed Church. So this is kind of funny. We're thinking about Mayflower and Plymouth Rock, but there are more churches in the state of Pennsylvania within the United Church of Christ than there are in the state of Massachusetts, because these Reformed churches, including the oldest Reformed church in the country, right in downtown Philadelphia, those churches join the church this way, and the United Church of Christ is formed in 1957. Big part of that is because after World War II, we can ascribe, I think, not only to the spirit of a God who loves unity, but the powerful exhaustion and heartbreak of people who had lived through World War II, the deep desire to create unity around the globe. So people were looking for ways to join together. And of course, some of our big global institutions, the United Nations, other important alliances are formed in that period. So the United Church of Christ is formed in 1957. And some people would say that Congregationalism ended there. Some would say that it's carried forward in the United Church of Christ. There were some Congregational churches who declined to join the United Church of Christ and formed the National Association of Continuing Congregational Churches, which is about 400 congregations around the country. If you go to the Congregational library, maybe they're the ones who should get the authoritative say on this, but if you go to the Congregational library on Boston Common in Boston, Massachusetts, they do everything up until 1957. But after that, it has to come to Cleveland if it's a UCC archival matter. So part of what happens is that the United Church of Christ is formed. In New York City, there's a big high rise. People call it the God Box, but it is the, I know, affectionately, 475 Riverside Drive up by Riverside Cathedral, which is UCC and American Baptist affiliated, up by Union Seminary and Grant's Tomb. We take up residence there, and so do many other denominations. And if you're ever in New York City, it is worth a visit to see the chapel. It is quite a modernist achievement in terms of religious architecture. And the UCC stays there for a number of years and then moves to Cleveland in order to be closer to the spirit of the West. And I think also to provide affordable housing for the staff members who were working for the church. That's still true today. I feel like I should pause for a second and take a drink of water and see if there are any mid-process questions. And then we're going to go forward. I have a fun video to share, but I focused a lot on history because the thread that really informs Congregationalism and the formation of the United Church of Christ is the strong desire to have local autonomy in the congregation, so that the scriptures can be studied, so that ideas can be explored freely. You don't really hear about heretics in the Congregational church anymore, because there is this strong value of intellectual inquiry and theological freedom. The other thing that I think is really important to think about when you talk about Congregationalism in the United Church of Christ, so there's this passionate commitment to creating forms that allow freedom to exist, spiritual and intellectual freedom to exist. There's also this powerful instinct to be in covenant, to be in a holy agreement with one another. So why do you have a denomination for churches that want to be independent? A huge part of it is a commitment to creating education and making a missionary impact on the world. Global missions out of the United States started in the United Church of Christ predecessor congregational bodies. And that commitment is, of course, not only held by the United Church of Christ or by our close cousins, but by all kinds of religious traditions. And part of what you learn when you do a lot of missionary work for many generations is that the world is large and deserves to be approached with humility and a passion for social justice. And so you will always hear more about social justice than you will about evangelism in a UCC environment. And it comes, I think, from that desire to impact the world without taking away anyone else's religious freedom as they seek to build their theological relationship with God and with the world. So I'm going to take my drink of water. I think maybe we could take one or two questions, and then I would like to move forward toward the end of the pieces that I have prepared. Is there a softball? Can somebody toss me a softball question?
Well, Manek posted a question on the chat. He said, "Are there more than one Adventists?"
Oh,
I don't know
it's
if that's a softball or not, but
well, it is because I'm not an Adventist, so I can give a totally unofficial answer, which is that it is my understanding that there are multiple types of Adventists, and that Seventh-day Adventists are the most famous because they go to church on a different day than everybody else. But I am not well versed in Adventist theology or practice. So the easiest question is the one you don't know the answer to, I suppose.
Where did the Christian Science Church and the Mormon Church come out of? Do they come out of the Congregational line or?
Well, I feel better prepared to say something about the Mormons, but they did not come out of the Congregational tradition. My understanding is that that was something that occurred on American soil. Is anybody actually, James, I feel like maybe we're more in your neighborhood.
yeah. So Joseph Smith's experiences, I'll say, that led to the formation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was during the time of, well, it would have been like around that 1810, 1820 type of time frame. And his family members were interested in the Presbyterian Church and the Methodist Church and Lutheran Church. And so they were really exploring lots of different churches at the time, listening to, lots of different preachers and participating in a lot of the revival also excitement at the time. So so I actually, I think most members of our church would, however, would not be surprised not to see us on a chart like that, because there really is no traditional formation of the church out of an existing religion or church at the time. I'm not sure how that would be for like Christian Scientists or some other, churches that are, maybe have similar types of more organic like formation, but.
And then what about the Quakers and, some of those churches, where did they come out of?
Let me put our chart back up here for a second. It is my understanding that those would fit into the Anabaptist tradition. And let's see where it is. It's going to be on this slide here. So see, that's not the best. It's not a little bit hard to see, but you can see down here, Amish, Mennonite, Hutterite. Yeah, and it's interesting if you think about it in terms of a spectrum. If you could take a slice like somewhere right around here in history and compare these churches, they would feel very different if you walked into a community. A Lutheran community in 1850 is very, very different, I should say it in a softer way, very different than a Quaker community in 1850. And Quakers were greatly persecuted. The Congregationalists were running things for a long time, and they valued intellectual freedom. They often, the bitter sweet, well, not even sweet, sort of the bitter joke is that they wanted intellectual freedom but didn't grant it as freely as they craved it. And so that is a self-critical reflection on my own history, right? but there were definitely, actually, this is kind of a nice lead into, I was going to do just a couple of snapshots from the background of Congregationalism in the United Church of Christ. And this takes us in that direction. I was going to introduce you. Oh, if you really are interested and want to read a lot more, the United Church of Christ website, which is actually being updated as we speak. So some of the pages are even have like better images and photography than even just recently. UCC.org has a whole history short course. And you could just read through, and I think it's very pleasantly written. So there's something for those who are interested to learn more. And I believe it was written by Barbara Brown Zickman, which is probably she's one of the great living historians of American Protestant Christianity. So here's a snapshot. We're talking about the Great Awakening, right? And the Great Awakenings, as James was just talking about. So one of the extraordinary minds shaping the early years of our country before it was a country was Jonathan Edwards, American revivalist preacher, philosopher, Congregationalist theologian. He is known for writing what some people say is the greatest sermon in the history of the United States, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. This is not a sermon title that I have ever used. And of course, while it may not be palatable to contemporary, more progressive Christians in the United Church of Christ, there's a really important depth of theological development that happens within the Congregationalist sphere. And one of the things they really care about is an educated clergy. And so they found Harvard and Yale. And when they get out to the West Coast, they found what is now the University of California at Berkeley. And they found seminaries. After abolitionism is a massive movement in the Congregational Church leading up to the Civil War. Colleges are founded in the Reconstruction period across the South and up into the North for people coming out of slavery. The founding of educational institutions is a major theme in the history of Congregationalism in the United States. And I think that's one of the things that, while some of our historic efforts were deeply harmful alongside their intention to help, the founding of educational institutions and the inculcation of a value of education for all people is, I think, one of the gifts that we can perhaps be more proud of than some of the other things we've done. Speaking of abolitionism, I wanted to share a snapshot of our history, a very famous moment in pre-Civil War history. There was a ship, a Spanish slave ship called La Amistad. You maybe saw a movie. Steven Spielberg made a movie about 25 years ago about this. And Spanish sailors captured people and brought them across the ocean. But about halfway across, the people who were going to be sold into slavery mutinied and took over the ship and demanded that it be steered back to Africa. And the Spanish sailors managed to deceive the enslaved persons on the ship by sailing to the United States at night. So ultimately they landed in Connecticut, and this was very devious. The person who charted the landing intentionally landed them in Connecticut because slavery was still legal there. So this was a massive international debacle. Spanish ship, the English were involved, the United States was involved. This was a massive international controversy, and it became a legal battle, which is what you saw in the movie. And John Quincy Adams argued on behalf of the freedom of the enslaved people. And the folks who paid for the legal battle were Congregationalists who cared about abolitionism. And that experience was part of the abolitionist movement, which brought white Northern churches, essentially radicalized white Northern churches to become anti-slavery. Henry Ward Beecher and his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Congregationalists. And part of what happened was that this instigated the whole involvement in establishing education for free Black people in the South. And so I put an image of La Amistad, and I put a historic flyer from the American Missionary Association, and I put the UCC symbol on the left because the American Missionary Association was folded into the United Church of Christ when it was formed in 1957 in the Justice and Witness Department of our national church. So I wanted to give just a few snapshots. I think that's one that is, excuse me, something that we're really happy about. It's nice to be able to tell a story about your ancestors doing something that could make you so proud. Something else I'm also very proud of is that the Congregational Church educated and ordained the first woman to the ministry in contemporary times. And in the culture of the United Church of Christ, we try to be very careful about that because we want to honor the women who are spoken of as leaders in the early church in the Christian scriptures. Her name was Antoinette Brown, and you know, she was ordained to preach on the Western Front because her congregation needed a pastor, and they had the freedom to ordain the person that they felt was their appropriate minister called by God. This is in 1852. And that's like the trick question in the UCC is, when was Antoinette Blackwell ordained? Because it always gets miswritten as 1952. And no, it was 1852. Before the Civil War even occurred, we had the ability to put a woman into the pulpit and at the sacramental table. We are proud of our firsts, hopefully not proud in a vain kind of way, but one that I got to experience was that I went to the national meeting of our denomination in 2005, and I got to stand in the convention center and watch the delegates from across our national church vote in order to support marriage equality for all people, regardless of gender. This was in Atlanta. It was the 4th of July, and it was hot, but it was remarkable. The New York Times was there. You could cut the tension in the room with a knife because there would be churches, congregations who would leave the denomination if equal marriage was affirmed, and they did. Some might come back someday, and some maybe wouldn't ever. But we were the first denomination to affirm marriage equality, and now it's the law of the land. And we can't claim, of course, sole credit for that as a denomination or a national church. You know, lots of different people made a lot of different sacrifices for that bit of justice to unroll in our time. And yet, to try to stand on the right side of history is a faith act in the United Church of Christ. And it's something that I'm proud of, but it also comes with its costs. Although in the Christian tradition, we're aware that the cost and joy of discipleship is one of the things that we will balance. So I'm going to move to, actually, I'm going to look at, I can't see you all right now, so I'm just going to look around, read the room, see if anybody's snoozing. No, okay, we're all still here together. I am going to now indulge myself and show you something that I think is really fun. And this is a seminary student, so two brothers who were training for the ministry. This was their final exam project for a history class about the United Church of Christ in their graduate school setting. And it is a fun tribute to the history of the UCC and who way back in the history, in all of those strands that were moving across our screen, who was back there in those strands that we can't necessarily take credit for their successes or really bear the full burden of their shames, but we can try to think of ourselves as members of a long line of witnesses who attempt to do justice in the ways of Jesus. So what better way to think about these things than to have a fun musical moment? So I'm going to click on this. We're not going to do that now. I'm going to make sure that I've got the sound buffered on the share. I'm going to actually, you know what, I think it looks like it'll be okay. Please wave at me. Oh, wait, let me just press this button. There we go. All right, we're going to try and do this here.
The United Church of Christ has many confessors, current members.
So we don't see the video.
Uh-oh.
The Christian and the congregation.
Uh-oh. You hear, but you do not see?
Yeah, I think you may need to share your screen again to share the video.
Okay.
And then
I'll
you
just
can click the two buttons that say, share video and share sound.
got
So I
it.
think we're probably hearing the sound from your own speaker. So
Okay.
try that again.
Here we go. We'll optimize for a video clip. And I'll back it up to the beginning.
The United Church of Christ has many confessors, current members, or of its predecessors. The Christian and the Congregationalist Church in 1931 said, hey, let's merge. Then the Evangelical Synod and the German Reformed followed suit in 1934. In 1957, the merging was done when all four came together so that all may be one. So the church is Christian and Congregational, Reformed and Evangelical. And the United Church of Christ has many famous confessors, either current members or of its predecessors, like the brothers Niebuhr and the actress Redgrave, Marilyn Robinson and Ernest Hemingway, and John Adams and Calvin Coolidge living in the people's house, and Walt Disney who brought the world Minnie and Mickey Mouse. Andrew Young, Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, Leonard Pitts, the columnist, shining a light in the dark, Charles Hart Towns, the mazer inventor, Timothy Dwight, the diploma presenter, Howard Dean and Oprah Winfrey and Barack Obama know that you never put a period where God has put a comma. Bill Holden, Wendell, Corey, Lynn Harding, and actors you would know. Authors like Theodore Dreiser and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Paul Tillich, Dean Koontz, and old John Brown. Thornton Wilder, who told us about our town. With the artist's pen, Alex Ross, John Milton, Paradise Lost. presidential spots, and of course the famous hymn writer, Isaac Watts. William Sloane Coffin of the Riverside Church, the Supreme Court's Oliver Ellsworth, the Navy's famous George Bancroft, and Donald Hall, the poet laureate, Matt Doreen, who really can dance, and Susan Thistlethwaite giving peace a chance, and science fiction writer Mervyn Peake could tell you listen, because God is still speaking. There are many different members of the UCC at many different points along life's journey. The many public figures in the church are well known. Those who worshiped in the churches from which this church has grown. But a list like this is never really done, 'cause in our midst all are still welcome. And always remember that this is true, that the most important member of the church could be you.
So now that we've had our musical interlude, I think we'll segue into questions and open discussion. And James, do you have a way you want to move us forward?
Yeah, we'll just let's see. I don't see any others in the chat, so let me switch the view here. So, who has a question for Reverend Larssen? Thanks for that presentation. And yeah, Father Alexi.
Reverend Larssen, that was absolutely excellent. Thank you very much. Very,
Oh,
very
thank you.
educational. A couple of questions or points. First of all, those two charts that you showed us at the beginning, are they on the UCC website, or would you be willing to share them with me?
I would be happy to share them with you. They are popular materials from the internet. They are not scholarly materials from the church. That's why that's why I sort of interpreted them and
That's
said,
why the caution.
Yeah, that's why I said, this makes it look like we're the only church in the world, and no one really thinks that, so that kind of thing. But I'll send James the PowerPoint.
Perfect, perfect. I'm the ecumenical officer for the Roman Catholic Archdiocese here, and sometimes I'm asked to outline the family tree, and I think the
yes.
charts have done a good job of it. So I'd like to use them. Thank you very much.
Happy to help. Happy to help.
And
I was wondering. Yeah.
you are were you the successor to Jerry Stinson?
I was. Yes.
Yes, I used to work a lot with Jerry when he was there.
He's just a wonderful person.
Yeah. And we just had the 250th anniversary of the founding of the San Gabriel Mission, the first Christian entity here in Southern California.
Yes.
And I invited Reverend Von Gran, I believe is one of your interim conference ministers, and he came to the celebration.
Oh, good.
So I'm hoping that we can continue to work together on things.
That's very good. I'm glad to hear that went so well. Yes, I think it's very interesting. I do not think that there's enough attention paid to the expansion of Christianity in a historical sense from the West Coast inward.
Can I call you back?
Yes, I agree with you.
There's a lot of focus on how Christianity spreads from the East Coast across the country, of course, because whole denominations are founded in connection with that westward expansion. But all along, we have the mission system, which of course is so essential in California history too.
Yeah.
Not
without its less lustrous points, as you pointed out, and other things, but
absolutely,
it's still influential. Absolutely.
Thank you. Absolutely. Well, thank you. Thank you for your kind words.
Yeah, I also really enjoyed, your historical presentation, because I'm a kind of a history buff, about all kinds of
Yeah.
areas, and
Mhm.
religion is one of the fascinating, areas, how they developed and spread and all that. What about the Cathars? Cathars or something. There was one group like that in Europe, I think, and
Hmm.
and I think the Roman Church had a fight with, you know,
No
those
doubt. We fought with almost everyone. So don't worry.
right,
I don't know about that,
right,
unfortunately.
No,
right,
I don't recognize that name either.
right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
But
It's amazing what's out there, though. I mean,
But Manik, that doesn't mean we didn't fight with them. Just because I don't
right,
recognize it doesn't mean.
right. Well, in the current times, do you see that there is a tendency for all these different churches to unite more or something, or how are things going?
I love that's a great question. How are things going?
Right.
And this is really, I think, my area of interest is I really am interested in religion. I mean, I have my personal spiritual my personal spiritual focus. I have my favorite theologians. I have my favorite books of the Bible, but I get really interested in the sociological elements of religion, because how can you continue to lead a church as a pastor, or how can you continue to make a contribution to society, which people of faith sincerely want to do, when society is so rapidly changing? So this is what I would say as an armchair church historian and sociologist. The major headline in the United States is that we are becoming more religiously diverse
Mm,
and less observant.
mm,
There's part of that is because there's been an extraordinary amount of migration. I mean, we were living in one of the most transitory times in human history. So many people are moving around the country and around the world, excuse me. And of course, some of that's very tragic. But what we are seeing is that people bring their religions with them, and that lends diversity, which is, increases the the density of religious practice in our country. And at the same time, many of the great institutional churches of Protestant Christianity that you saw on that diagram are really in a period of I don't want to say reconstruction, but it's almost like deconstruction, because they do not, most of our denominations in the white Protestant mainline do not have the population that we had in the 1950s. I mean, this is another thing too. More people went to church in the 50s and 60s in this country than any other time in the history of this country. Church attendance now it's bad. It's just terrible when you compare it to like the 50s and 60s. But if you compare it to other times in history, it's not so bad. Like that is, I think, very interesting, because there's so many Americans who remember the huge Protestant culture of the 50s and 60s when, suburbs were being built and you put a church and a public school in every suburb. And the programs of denominations were extremely influential. The theologians in our denomination were Reinhold Niebuhr was on the cover of Time magazine. And it's been an interesting thing. I was ordained in 2004, so I'm cruising toward a 20-year anniversary. And I'll tell a personal story. My graduate year of seminary, my last year of my seminary degree, I was a student at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley. Two things happened, and these are sad things. One was 9/11 happened in September of my last year of my seminary graduate education. The other thing that was happened, and Father Alexei, I'm sorry to raise this, but the Spotlight team of the Boston Herald broke the story about priest abuse. And I have reflected, now that I'm cruising toward a 20-year, reunion on my graduation, I have reflected that that those two events are very symbolic about the crisis of confidence in institutional religion that I have observed. And one is that we need excellent interfaith answers to the questions of how to be religious in a diverse world. We need excellent, caring, relational answers about how to be together with differing beliefs.
Right.
And the other is that people were just, I think people even far outside of the Roman Catholic Church were just crushed by that scandal. And there were similar ethical scandals in many denominations. There were scandals, financial scandals. There were just so many scandals.
Right.
And that the church, not just one denomination or one part of the church, but that throughout the institutional church, it appeared that the institution had betrayed its integrity, I think is a massive crisis of confidence for people in my age group. And of course, what we've seen is, institutional scandals are not just the business of religious organizations. The Boy Scouts have their own, and, we see companies rise and fall. And so we know that there is no one institution that can shoulder all the responsibility for that. And yet I think there are reasons that people turn away from organized religion. And I try to take those with a lot of sensitivity. And not just say, it's because you want to play soccer on Sunday morning, or you want to go to brunch, which clearly people do want to play soccer and go to brunch. But I think that what it calls a church like the United Church of Christ, which has about 750,000 members in North America, something less than 5,000 independent congregations. The average congregation has 165 members. Most people in the UCC belong to a small neighborhood church that worships about 50 people on a Sunday. In many ways, it's to be a part of the fabric of society is the call. But that's very hard when we remember the importance of being an institution. And I think that is the active struggle about, how is it going? Well, it's kind of hard because we want to continue to be a pillar of society. And yet we are also called to be on the leading edge and to push the frontier and try to bring the message of Jesus Christ in a way that is relevant to today's challenges with as much integrity as we can.
What I tell my own community, is that, we also have people with orthodox views and reformist views, and in between people who sometimes don't care, they just live life, enjoy, eat, drink, and be merry type of thing. I suggest, that all the different groups, different religions also, they should look at the original principles that were expressed by the founders of the religions, like what did Jesus Christ say, about being charitable, honest, justice, all those kind of things. And similarly in the Hindu religion, they have, Krishna, doing similar thing. Muslims, Muhammad had said some probably similar things. And in Zoroastrian religion, we had our prophet Zarathustra, whose original compositions we are still lucky to have, as part of our religious scriptures, in the very ancient language, But I say that, all the rules and traditions they develop, maybe differently because in different countries, different time in history, whatever the needs were. But if just like today, we have a lot of news, right, on social media. and you have to say, okay, which one is fake news and which are the facts, right? And we have to determine. So I
Yeah.
say that whenever you want to have a doubt about a rule or regulation or tradition, try to match it with the original words of the prophet, to
Mhm.
see if they satisfy the principles that were, expressed by the prophets, And so if the rule says, those people are evil and we can kill them or, persecute them because God wants us to do that, then they should compare it with what Jesus Christ said, in the Christian religion. Similarly, the Muslim religion, and all that. Muslim religion, Muhammad said, there is no compulsion in religion, But
Mhm.
when these, after his followers, they started conquering other countries and to create their empires, they forgot about that, They started, many of them started, persecuting, forcing conversion and all that kind of thing. So that's my suggestion to my people, at least, and I think that could be something to think about,
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Yes. Cheryl.
Hi. I just have a question on how do you balance the between the governing body in Cleveland and the
Mhm.
autonomous nature of the different congregations?
Structure. I love a good structure. Well, we have a oh, you know what? Did I have a picture of this? I'm going to check in my I might have had a picture of this. We have a national structure that organizes the. Here we go. I am going to share this really quickly because it will make things very very clear as soon as I do this. So we do divide the country into regions called conferences, and within the conferences are smaller groups, especially in the highly populous areas called associations. And the associations and the conferences do much of the work that would be done by a bishop in a church with a higher liturgical tradition. So for my ordination process, I had to get my undergraduate degree, I had to get my graduate degree, and I had to pass the ordination process, which was very much like a dissertation. I had to write theological treatises and I had to defend them in front of a committee. But it was the committee that had the authority to grant permission for me to be ordained. And so you can see there are these different regional areas. And so those are called conferences, and that is the structure. And what we say is that it's a covenantal structure, and covenant is a theological principle based in the Hebrew scriptures when God makes a covenant with Abraham and Sarah to be their God if they will be God's people. And so the local congregation has a lot of authority. It owns its own land. It can hire its own staff and clergy. It can set its own program of study and activity and mission. But the authority to ordain rests with the regions of the United Church of Christ, the conferences and associations. And what we often say is that the national staff and the national setting speaks to the church and not for the church. And so there's a sense, I sort of feel like I joined the diplomatic corps rather than, because it's almost like, every 2 years we have these synod events, which are big conferences, and we pass resolutions that set the program and set the issues and priorities. And then now I'm on the national staff, then we go do those things. And we do have a general minister and president and 2 associate general ministers and associate general ministers, so that the administration of the church is effective, and that there is a voice to speak on behalf of the church, because somebody does need to stand up to the microphone and say something important when there are okay, I'm going to preach a little bit. When there are tragedies in our country, there need to be voices expressing love and compassion into the microphone on CNN, and not just the same very, very sometimes distressingly uncompassionate voices, discompassionate voices that we hear sometimes over and over again. So I'm really proud that we have people who can stand up to the microphone when we have that general minister and president who's great at it. But I also really appreciate that there's always this element of choice, and that that we have chosen to be the church together. And sometimes I wish we were closer knit. I wish that maybe that the structure was a little more hierarchical and efficient. But there is always that there is always room for the Spirit to say and do new things among the churches of the UCC. And that's why you heard in the song the emphasis on putting a comma instead of a period, or that God is still speaking. There's this idea that we need to respond to the Spirit's call today. And I really appreciated what the last gentleman just said about, testing today's issues and questions against the words of your founder in faith. And just be open to the idea that God may speak a new understanding for today's issues into the scriptures and the words of for us, Jesus Christ. Yeah, you bet. So I invited my mom.
Beth wants to speak.
That's my mom. She gets to speak, except she's muted.
Oh,
You have to unmute, Beth. Yeah, and then you
you have to unmute yourself.
Takes a little
Elena
minute.
understands that me unmuting myself is a rare occurrence.
It's true. She tries to be very discreet.
In terms of polity, we have the UCC is this big umbrella that embraces a whole lot of differences of governance, the top-down kind of thing, Presbyterial style, Congregational style. But I think is the question that I want to raise to you. The Congregational style says each individual congregation can choose to go along with a resolution that came up in the national conference or not. And Elena's birth church chose to not move forward with a social action item before her birth because it was a real agrarian town. Now, the point of the question is, do you feel that there's a nimbleness in terms of social action because of local church autonomy?
I do think that's the upside of local church autonomy, is that there's enough room to be a little bit radical sometimes. And the first ordination of an openly gay candidate for ministry happened in San Francisco in the Golden Gate Association of the Northern California Nevada Conference. Bill Johnson was ordained, I think it was 1971, because St. John's UCC down by Laguna Honda Hospital, they discerned and they tested him in ministry, and they thought that he was a suitable candidate for ministry and called by God. And it was San Francisco in the 70s, and gosh darn it, it was about time that some doors were opened to the rainbow community to be in leadership. And so they nominated him, and the association approved him, and he was ordained. And there was maybe an opening where there had been a closed door before. That was something that really distinguished the UCC for a very long time. When I started in ministry, I was in school in Berkeley with United Methodists who could not say a word about their personal life because they knew that they were gay and they would never get a job, never get ordained. And I have had the privilege of seeing a really enormous transition and an expansion in the understanding of who makes a suitable spiritual leader. And of course, our society has shifted a lot in that regard. But I think that's the upside to the autonomy. I think the downside is sometimes we don't all get on the same page and make as big of an impact as we could. It's really wonderful when when Christians or people of faith come together to do shared work. Because even if not as many people go to church nowadays as used to, the influence of moral voices that come from a place of power is undeniably impactful. You know, there was a woman in my church in Long Beach who was like, Elena, can you come to this thing and wear your collar? And I said, okay. I said, well, you know, sometimes I don't know all the details of the issue. And she said, well, you'll learn it when you get there, but people need to see the collar show up because they need to know that people of faith care about these issues and that there are eyes from that are looking with a moral perspective at the issues of the day, not just the business perspective or the land use, or, you know, Long Beach always has lots of land use issues. You know, so you know, that was an important reminder that our shared voice, our shared faithful voice, is really quite important and not dependent on how many people populate our pews. That's something that is still a vibrant ministry. So I take a lot of inspiration in that. You know, that the voice of the prophet has not expired in its powerfulness. Well, we have reached about halfway through our second hour.
Yeah,
And
I have a question.
Oh, good.
So so one of the things that I always ask is to hear about how your approach, you know, as a member of your faith community, of helping young people make moral choices. I'll say good choices, positive choices, and maybe in that context, I got like, I understand that there's a big emphasis on speaking out on what as you termed it, social justice, and, you know, speaking out on social issues and things like that. And in the context of a moral framework. So I'm curious to understand, you know, what are the key, if you were to say, what are the key, like 2 or 3 moral issues for young people today, what would you think that those are? And then what do you do, or like if it's your practice or your role, or maybe as you've been like a pastor at a local church, to sort of like work with youth on those things. So I guess maybe that's the first question, is just to see what are in your mind the top few moral issues for youth. Let's say young people. I mean, you know, teenagers and stuff, right? Those that probably come in, you know, have more challenges with making you know, choices because they're establishing their independence and things like that, and it's, they have a lot of responsibility. So
you know, I think it's interesting because the teenagers, people who are in high school right now, are going to high school during this extraordinary multi-crisis of COVID and the racial reckoning that's happening in our country and around the world, the climate crisis, which is undeniably visible in communities all over the world, but gosh, the West Coast has really gotten what feels like more than its fair share, you know, and now the migrant crisis that's coming our way. You know, I think I worry less about the youth that I knew in my congregation making good choices than did I equip them adequately to keep hope alive inside of themselves during these times. Because they will be faced with all of the moral dilemmas of normal maturation. You know, they're going to be faced with a confusing world where some drugs are now legal that used to be considered totally sinful. And they're going to have to make wise decisions about love and romance and sexuality and those sorts of things. And especially when I was a youth minister, we were always very careful to have open, fair, values-driven, and fair is not the best word, open, integrity-driven conversations about how to make healthy, faithful choices in your life. So frankly, sex, drugs, and rock and roll was part of our curriculum discussion in the youth ministry whenever I was the youth minister. It wasn't everything, like, good Lord, they need other things like just playing games and talking about life and eating popcorn. But we were very attentive to their spiritual and moral development. And for me, I was very fortunate, even in sort of the lefty side of the church, which could be more humanistic, I always had a strong dose of biblical scholarship in my upbringing and in my education. I tried to make sure I always brought that in, so that I didn't just pick a moral lesson and put it out there like a, bumper sticker. I tried to make sure that if we were talking about, let's say, one of the really difficult things, what sexual choices should they make in life, that we were really talking about that there's a theology here, that all people are children of God, and that there's a sanctity in your life and in your choices that you need to really think through, and you need to think through it before you're in a compromising situation. Because we know that kids will be faced with compromising situations in life, and we want them to have self-regard and regard for love and romance, so that they have a framework that actually works for them and carries them through to healthy, happy choices. The work I'm doing now it's interesting because it's kind of closed down to COVID, but I'm working to rebuild our national service learning fellowship program. So placing young adults in summer internships and year-long academic internships. And so in a way, I get to go back to, I was ordained to the campus ministry at Stanford University, and I really loved working with college students. So in a way, I'm getting to do on a national level what I loved in my early days of ministry. And that's a big part of it. I'm working right now to place a missionary on the border in between Tucson and Nogales, and he's going to be doing border ministries. And he just came from working overseas, and the woman who does the overseas things was like, you gotta, she knows this candidate really well, and she kind of keeps saying, we just have to make sure that these things come together. And like, he is still a person in formation. And that's part of what's exciting about it. To be able to be with people when they're deciding who they want to be in life is a great blessing. And I'm excited to be back more in that venue, more in that vein of the church. Ooh, I have a question. What does the National UCC think will be future trends in religious organizations in the next 10 to 20 years, USA or global? What do they expect versus what do they hope will happen? Elena, do you have the same thoughts and wishes? Well, I think one of the enormous current issues that I see as a huge priority in the National UCC right now is guiding communities as wisely as possible to deal with racism, and to help local communities try to, like, by communities, I mean congregations, doing what we can so that local congregations can respond to the challenges of the day, whether it is the arrival of Afghan refugees in your neighborhood, right? These things are happening and they are going to happen. How can local congregations respond in a way that really brings health and wholeness? Because in the UCC, we have done some really awful things in our history. We have made serious mistakes in the missionary work of the church, thinking that the institutional white church knew what was best for everybody else. And that, it is really important not to perpetrate those things. And so anti-racism work has got to be a companion piece with almost everything that we want to do in terms of healing and helping the world. I think the other big thing is trying to move from elaborate institutions into really functional nimble organizations. So this is the big example. The national offices, we own a big high-rise building in downtown Cleveland, and it's going to be sold. And I think day before yesterday, a lease was signed. We're going to move into a hybrid workspace in a high-rise, totally different. But the entire national staff is going to be on a hybrid work schedule. Would we have even ever thought of that 3 years ago or 2 years ago before COVID? No, not necessarily, but it's got to be the mission first, above the maintenance of the institution. What would I like? I would like, to me, that idea of putting the mission above the maintenance of the institution is really important, because it's easy, I think, to get frustrated. And it's like, oh man, the church used to be so big. We used to have such a great budget. We used to do this, we used to do that. But looking backward doesn't really motivate us to address the challenges of today. And that's where life and hope grows, is when we look forward and trust that the Spirit will be with us if we seek honestly to serve in the name of Jesus. So that is a question that is worth, when I've been on staff longer, I might have deeper thoughts. But I think that where I am in ministry is at a point where I have seen some struggles and I have seen some breakthroughs, but I am not anywhere close to retirement. And so seeing the struggles through to further breakthroughs is probably part of what I will do, no matter where I go.
I have another question.
Okay.
Can you describe, so a little bit, you talked about these internships, and I think you said sort of service mission. So I'm interested to understand, what are the types of activities, opportunities that folks in the UCC do in way of service, and a little bit of it. The thought that comes to my mind, when you talked about addressing racism, and I'll refine it over, there's a whole spectrum, people aren't all just either racist or not. There's prejudices and bigotry. I mean, there is a continuum. In terms of offering service or having people participate in service, where they get the chance to interact either by serving or working with people who are different and different culture, different ethnicity, different color, different, whatever the case may be. Is that have any, so I'm sort of two-part question, about service and what is the sort of emphasis or what's encouraged, and then if at all that might play into, addressing some of these kinds of challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. Robert McAfee Brown was a theologian out of Berkeley, and he always talked about creative dislocation. That part of what we do when we do the humanitarian ministries of the church is we take ourselves out of our comfort zone. We take ourselves out of our familiar space and habits and our own cultural setting, and we choose to creatively dislocate. It's a creative act to leave your location and go into another culture with the spirit of service in your heart. And that has always been my experience, which is why I believe I've been called to this particular ministry. The congregation which raised me up had a very strong mission trip culture, and that was something that I carried into my early ministry. And it was interesting because sometimes we need to do a project to make an impact, right? Somebody's got to build a school in rural Nicaragua so that people can go to school. So I went with Seeds of Learning and we built a school. But there are some projects that impact the volunteer far more than the quote unquote recipient. And that is the spirit of the service programs that I am working with. They are largely about the development of the volunteer. And a big part of the development of the volunteer is creatively dislocating from your familiar context into a new context, not without preparation. because just airdropping somebody into a situation and expecting them to thrive is not realistic. And that's, you know, that's where discipleship and training and preparation, education, what we would call praxis, which is the marriage of action and theological reflection. Those things are part of the process. But that's part of the adventure too. You know, that you can see a part of the world by the virtue of the church's network and the church's commitment to hospitality that you would never see otherwise. For me, a big example is that I got to go to the Philippines, a church-to-church pilgrimage. And we went and visited and spent time with our United Church of Christ in the Philippines counterparts in the southeast jurisdiction of Mindanao, which is a State Department red zone. So, you know, it was an adventure, right? Nothing bad happened, but we had to be creatively dislocated from our comfort zone. And I am always, I mean, there's just a little part of me that is there because I was so completely welcomed, not as a stranger, but as a sort of a long lost member of the family. And that was because it was the church and I was part of the church. And I have often thought about that, you know, I'm part of something so much bigger than myself or my denomination. It's not just now, it's the history that lies behind us. And of course, the future that calls us forward. But to be part of something so much larger than yourself is the kind of experience that changes how you want to live your life. And that's the spirit of the service learning fellowships that I'll be working on. That young people who are at a crucial time in their lives to do what we can for them to make the avant-garde choice to do voluntary service instead of getting a job or finishing a degree, or, you know, not that they should put off their education, you know, forever, but that, you know, it is pretty countercultural to say, you know, I've just graduated from college. I'm going to go do a service fellowship for a year instead of, you know, becoming a junior associate at Bear Stearns, because those are the choices that some kids have coming out of college. So,
yeah. So let me ask. Well, let me just make a comment. I can definitely appreciate, not necessarily from my own experience, but I can appreciate putting a young person out of their context. My son is serving a mission for our church, and right now he's in the Ivory Coast. And
wow.
so he was there before COVID, and then came back, took a year of college, and then returned. And I can say, you know, you definitely get an appreciation for the willingness of someone to sort of have this sort of like interrupted, you know, path where, oh, I thought I was going to go do this and then go to college, and as opposed to, oh, going to college and then doing it, and then, you know, life just makes things complicated. And it's definitely important. The amount it's a unique experience for many of our youth that serve in Africa or the Philippines or wherever, or South America. But I also recognize that, and this is part of my question about the opportunities. Let's say they're a little more like in our backyards, because there are also young people in my church that will, you know, they'll serve like a Spanish-speaking mission in Boston or in somewhere else, and the it's a proselyting mission, so they do teach people about the gospel of Jesus Christ. They teach them about our church, and, you know, what we practice and how we think it can help, you know, bless their lives. I don't change their lives, but, you know, even if it's good to, you know, make it better, that's definitely important. But also looking for opportunities to serve others, to show, you know, as part of showing love to other people, regardless of their situation, you know, based on what their needs are. And a person's needs can span many things, right? It can be economic, it can be physical, it can be emotional and spiritual as well. So So when someone has, let me ask it this way then, when someone has a kind of experience that you're helping, you're running this program to help them have, how have you seen, or have you had the chance to sort of see how that then in fact impacts them when they, let's say, sort of settle into some local congregation or community? Is there
Yeah.
something, or maybe even a part of your goal, that in having that experience, how it would impact the way that they serve, like the needs in their area? Because my son now, he speaks French, he's familiar with the location and the culture, and he may go back there to serve, but also there's a lot that comes out of that experience that allows him to just see a need like right there, and sometimes our world is so fascinating in the sense that sometimes the need comes to us, right? We have migrants, or we have refugees, that come from different parts of the world, that then, there's an opportunity to serve them as well. So what would your, I guess maybe the way to ask it is, what would your goals be for those young people or individuals that participate in this experiential program, and the skills that they learn? What would your goals be for them as they then eventually get that job at Bear Stearns or whatever? Because
move back into
if all they say
society.
is, "Oh, hey, I'm making money now, and that's my focus,"
Yeah.
you would want that to that spirit of giving, of serving, of having an impact, of blessing the lives of others to persist, right? So can you share your thoughts on that? And
Well,
maybe
you're actually saying it very beautifully. You're making my argument for me about the value of service learning fellowships, which is the language we would use. But that's really part of it, is that when somebody comes back, they never come back the way they were, right? That instead they've had powerful educational and developmental opportunities to gain practical skills, for a kid who grew up in a monolingual culture to have an opportunity to become bilingual. Not saying that that's your son's case, but for example, that's phenomenal. That is a phenomenal life skill that changes their prospects in life and makes them more able to live in a globalized culture. That is, to me, that's just an inherent good, right? Somebody who's more able to be a good cultural friend and neighbor. That's amazing. I think one thing, because the missionary history is quite painful in the background of the Congregational church, there have been times when we were like, let's just not really do evangelism. Let's just really focus on the humanitarian side. And I think that my hope is to bring a bit of a corrective to that, and to really emphasize mentorship by faith leaders for young adults. And part of it is because our church, like many denominations, is really blessed in the elder generation. There are a lot of phenomenal people who are perfect mentors for young adults. And those relationships do not happen spontaneously or organically. The cultural divide between older adults and younger adults has to be bridged with intentionality. But that's something I really value, and that's something that I really see as important. I want them to know that a faith leadership perspective can be the transformational perspective that communities lead. And you can be a faith leader even if your job is totally secular. You can be a faith leader as a politician or a business person or a member of a service profession, or not at all.
I really appreciate what you say. I want to throw an idea out, and that is that our church, my church, has had some experience that there are certain parts of the world that, because of political, governmental constraints, we're not allowed to overtly proselyte, right? To teach the religious principles in the Soviet, in Russia, and in particular, and in mainland China. And so the emphasis is on service, and they're careful. I mean, it's not just that they call them service missionaries as opposed to missionaries,
Mhm.
but that is the emphasis of showing love, providing service, of looking for opportunities to help. So it definitely it's fascinating for me to see where it may be appropriate, I'll say, because if we're too set in our mind that, oh, I have to go like teach people about my church and get them to join my church and whatever, and on that extreme, or if they're too set on, oh, I'm just going to go and serve and help, then there's missed opportunities based on how sort of what the needs are. And
Right.
so it's a fascinating thing. And then so I appreciate your thought that there is a mix. It doesn't have to be all one or all the other,
Right.
and that brings a lot of value as well. It's okay to share with people, what about our relationship with God or whatever, right? And
Mhm.
why that helps us, if it can bring a
Yeah.
benefit to others, I would say. And there are certain communities that my church doesn't proselyte to. The joke is always a friend of mine who served in Central Illinois on his mission, and that's where I grew up. He said, well, in our mission, they told us that we weren't supposed to go, we were not supposed to go teach the Amish, because if they join our church, we'll lower the standard that they live their life than what they're doing right now. So.
Well,
And so,
yeah.
I mean, a little tongue in cheek, but also recognizing that when people's faith is driving them to do good and positive things and to live to, a standard that, part of having, I guess, an interfaith perspective helps us to love and appreciate that about them, right?
Mhm.
And so I guess that's if no one else has a question, I have one last question. I don't have a lot of time, but I would like to hear about a little bit about your interfaith experiences, and are you having interfaith experience opportunities in your new position?
Mhm.
Because one of the things that I've really learned is I've had chances. I've come to appreciate um, my friends who are not of the same church that I am, when I see their level of commitment or devoutness. So I'll draw a little connection to Father Alexi. I have some good friends that go to his parish or part of his community. He the land docs, and they have three boys, triplets, that played baseball and soccer with my son, and spent a lot of time with them. We traveled, around to go to baseball tournaments and stuff like that. And one of the things that I really realized and appreciated was, I could have like just lots of great conversations and have so many shared values with them, in large part because of, I recognize their level of commitment, their devotion, if you will, and I see the positive that it brings to their lives and how, how they interact with me. So that to me is one of the greatest benefits of, participating in interfaith activities, is that we get to see and recognize and appreciate the strength that comes from each of us practicing our religion, in a committed way. So I'm curious to hear, what's your experience been in Cleveland and in your new
Mhm.
position? How does your involvement with interfaith activities how's that part of sort of your role and where you're at right now?
Honestly, my role, I'm still so new that I don't think that I have a really good answer for you yet about that. Though you really should have had me ask for an offering, because that was a beautiful devotional about the value of interfaith organizations. So, so I will. I'll say, don't forget, Long Beach Gives is an amazing program. So if you can give tonight. See, now you don't even have to ask. But for me, I had maybe a triple blessing. One is that I I got my graduate degree in Berkeley, where there are 9 seminaries on one hill next to UC Berkeley. So I took my history from the Lutherans, and I took a spirituality class with the Unitarians, and I took theology with the Jesuits, and that was unbelievably rich in terms of opening my understanding to other Christian traditions. And then my first position in ministry was in I was one of the representatives in the Stanford Associated Religions organization, and worked closely with the dean of the chapel at Memorial Church. And that meant I worked every day with people who didn't think I had a right to preach. And we all had to find a way to still work together. And it is really important, I think, to acknowledge how much interpersonal kindness matters in those moments. I really hit it off with, I shared an office with the junior Catholic priest, and we tried to be as congenial as we could, but we knew there was a spirit of competition because everybody wanted students to join their organizations. So it could have been not always pleasant. And sometimes there was some sense of antipathy between organizations, but largely I had just a totally formative experience. I made really good friends with the new rabbi at Hillel. She grew up in Temple, Israel in Long Beach, California. And now we've been friends for all these years. And we would do scripture study together. And people came because they were like, wait a minute, an interfaith scripture study? This is something we haven't really seen before. And so that was really meaningful. And then I would say, fast forwarding to being in Long Beach, I inherited the great blessing of a congregation that cares about interfaith work, and was actively involved with CCEJ and SCIC, and had relationships not only with Temple Israel. We actually celebrated our 60-year anniversary of partnership while I was in ministry at First Church, but also there's strong congregations throughout the city and in the surrounding area, rich cultural diversity. So I've been very fortunate. I have been in settings where making real, kind friendships with people from different religious traditions was possible. And I just carry that value with me, that if nothing else, try to be a good friend. Try to be a great friend. If you can be a great friend, probably a lot of the other things will go a lot better if you have differences of opinion or practice. And I know that's very elementary, but it really mattered for a lot to me when I was the person who was in the less powerful position, where I was the person who could have been ignored or silenced or disregarded in an organizational setting, when I could have been overlooked and insulted, and instead was treated as a person of substance and was treated with friendship and kindness. That was very eye-opening, and I never quite forgot that a good bit of things, a good bit of what seem like complicated issues are much better if we intend to all be friends after the discussion is over.
Yeah, well said. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it
So-
has just been a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thanks. So
I
everyone,
was also at Stanford University in the 90s. I was like a part of the Dean of Religions group.
Yes,
Of different religious faith leaders, and I was like a liaison for the Zoroastrian students, that studied over there, and we used to have quarterly meetings, and discuss about how at the orientation time, all these different denominations, especially Christian denominations, would be competing with each other to get convert the students into their denomination. But I enjoyed, communicating with different representatives, different religions.
I did the same thing at USC in the 90s when I was in graduate school. I was on the USC's Religious Organizations Council. There was a was a council of the leaders, you know, and then there was a council of students. And so it's great. It's interesting that we've had these experiences, which partly, I guess, brings us in this path. But I had a very similar experience, made a great friend of a student that was in the Hillel group. And then like a year or so later, when he had moved on to the University of Illinois, I went to visit him when I was back home, you know, visiting, and he gave me a tour of their center, and you know, all the different ways that they had things set up for the different the different Jewish traditions, you know, to allow them to all worship, you know, in the same facility, but you know, with the differences that came. So it was great to have that. That was very formative for me as well, I think. So there are so many good opportunities, you know, on the college campuses, and it's great that they have these, you know, have the ability to support the religious diversity, to bring people together, right? That's what you really have to have first, is a tolerance for religious diversity, and then allow folks to come together. So thanks for bringing that up, and I appreciate that.
I also met Clinton and Hillary and their daughter Chelsea, because Chelsea graduated.
She was a student,
around that time, you know, and we used to have a procession of religious leaders at some kind of a convocation type thing, you know, go out on the stage and, you know, people speak. And you know, when I was passing by, and Clinton was, of course, you know, they all clap, stand up and clap. And so I didn't recognize him as Clinton, but, you know, somehow I thought I knew this person by seeing him. And so I put out my hand, you know, and shake hand with him, you know, and I must have given a heart attack to the Secret Service, you know. I just said,
I don't
hello.
know. Manek, I think you look pretty harmless, so I didn't raise any concern.
I was in my white, you know, priestly robes and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So we'll give you a chance, Reverend Larssen, to say any kind of closing prayer words, and then we'll dismiss until next month. Before we do that, I do want to share really quick my screen to let everyone know that we will have the next Religion 101 will be in October, again, the fourth Thursday, and we're going to have Reverend David Brown from Wayfarers Chapel here in Palos Verdes to talk about the Swedenborgian Church. So that's really that's going to be. We'll pull up your chart and we'll ask him to point where. Where the Swedenborgian Church falls. So
David,
now that we all have that as a reference.
Yeah, David and I are classmates, and he is wonderful. You're going to really enjoy. You know, the sort of mystical piece that is such a strength in this Swedenborgian tradition. That's cool.
Yeah, so we're looking forward to that, and invite everyone in, and let your friends know, and those in your communities, because we can accommodate a lot, and I know a lot of people watch the videos on our YouTube channel, which is great, but we always welcome more people to participate. So glad to have everyone. So Elena, I'll turn over to you to close in whatever way you would like to, and then we'll be dismissed.
Well, I am going to read a quote from one of my favorite Congregationalists, Ralph Waldo Emerson, because I think there's this idea that religion is the path to a great life. And, you know, when that happens, it's terrific. But sometimes religion is just what helps you continue to face obstacles and challenges. And faith and our spirituality hopefully keeps us going. And I share this quote because he helps us remember, well, what success really is. To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to earn the appreciation of honest critics and endure the betrayal of false friends, to appreciate beauty, to find beauty in others, to leave the world a bit better, whether by a healthy child, a garden patch, or a redeemed social condition, to know that one life has breathed easier because you lived here This is to have succeeded. So as we conclude tonight, we all breathe easier because we have these times of friendship building. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of it with you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, everyone, and we'll see you next month. Still time for Long Beach Give, so you can log on there. So have a great evening. Till next time.